Welcome back to the deep dive. This is where we sift through detailed sources, the articles, the lexical entries, the critical commentary, to pull out the vital knowledge that matters most to you, our listener.
Today we're undertaking a deep dive into a single Hebrew root, a word that appears, I think, 164 times in the Old Testament, yet its English translation is often far too simplistic. That's shin nun aleph.
Right, that root is almost always rendered as to hate. And when you hear that word, you immediately picture, this intense, murderous malice. But our sources, these really precise linguistic and philological documents, they show us a semantic range that is staggeringly wide. Our mission today is to move past that simple translation.
Right.
And to really grasp the full nuanced spectrum of Śānēṟ, which stretches from utter destructive hostility all the way to a technical term meaning legal scorn, or even just being unloved.
We're going to see that Śānēṟ is not just an emotion, it's a mechanism. It's a mechanism that defines social status, legal fault, and the standard of divine righteousness. We're using highly technical research to illuminate a concept that is central to Reformed thought, the nature of separation and covenant fidelity.
So let's unpack this word.
Let's do it.
We should probably start with the technical identity of Śānēṟ. It might seem like a niche concept, but the linguistic evidence shows this root was, it was absolutely standard across the ancient Near East.
It was a common fixture of the West Semitic or WSEM language family. We find evidence of Śānēṟ, or at least Sheen, in several key regional languages. In Ugaritic, which is a language absolutely critical for understanding Canaanite religion and culture,
Right.
the root shin existed, and the plural participle form shina was used just to denote enemies.
Okay, so even at its earliest attested stages, outside of Hebrew, the root was tied to opposition and enmity.
Precisely. We see it also in Phoenician and even on the Moabite stone, where the phrase shini appears.
Which means?
It means my enemies. So it's clear that in the cultural corridor surrounding Israel, this root provided the standard verbal mechanism for describing conflict and opposition. It wasn't just, a casual dislike. It defined the party that stood against you.
Which makes the contrast with Akkadian pretty interesting. Akkadian was the lingua franca of Mesopotamia, the dominant language of empires, and yet they didn't use this root.
That is a telling linguistic geographical distinction. Akkadian, which represents the Eastern Semitic branch, lacked the shin root entirely. To convey dislike, hatred, or avoidance, Akkadian speakers used a different term, zeri. Right. And this suggests the specific semantic character and development of Śānēṟ belong uniquely to the Western region. It perhaps evolved a cultural understanding of antagonism that differed from the Mesopotamian focus.
Let's look at Aramaic, because the sources point to a critical legal development there.
Aramaic is crucial, absolutely crucial. It shows us how an emotional concept can acquire technical juristic weight. In various Aramaic dialects, so Jewish Aramaic, Egyptian Aramaic, Syriac, Mandaic, the roots Śānēṟ or related forms, they retain the meaning to hate, but they expanded its scope.
How did that legal shift actually happen?
Well, the word started covering concepts like separate and divorce. We see this specifically in the Elephantine potari from Egypt, which document Jewish legal practices. In Elephantine Aramaic, shun could technically mean to divorce from.
Wow.
And the passive participle and referred to a divorced woman.
That is a massive leap. It moves the word from describing an internal feeling malice or antipathy to describing a final, legal, public action, the severance of a covenant.
The implication is clear. The result of intense aversion is separation. Once that aversion is codified in law, the word itself can become shorthand for the separation itself. This historical usage will be very important when we look at the Hebrew law concerning the unloved wife and God's statement on divorce in Malachi. The core function of Śānēṟ is defining a decisive separation or severing of a relationship, whether it's emotional, spiritual, or legal.
Okay, let's shift back to the Hebrew Old Testament. We have a statistical anchor here. The verb yeno appears 164 times. Where are the concentrations, and what does that tell us about the core theological concerns?
The concentration is significant, and it speaks volumes about its role in defining covenantal living. We find it 32 times in Psalms, which, gives voice to the conflict between the righteous and their enemies. We find it 23 times in Proverbs, where it delineates moral choice and wisdom. And critically, 18 times in Deuteronomy, the heart of the Mosaic law, which establishes legal and covenantal standards. The clustering in these three books confirms that Śānēṟ is fundamental to biblical expressions of conflict, morality, and justice.
Let's break down the grammatical anatomy, maybe focusing on the verbal stems, because that seems to be where the linguistic nuance truly lies. What does the base qual stem cover?
The qual stem is the workhorse. It's the simplest form, it appears 79 times, and it's the active voice, meaning simply to hate. This describes the active state or feeling, I hate you, or they hate the law. It's very direct.
Then we have the passive forms.
Right. The nipple stem is the passive. It defines the state of being acted upon. It means to be or become hated. And if you look at the contrast in Proverbs 14:20, the poor man is hated even by his neighbor, but the wealthy has many friends. The poor man is the subject of the nifal, the passive recipient of scorn. It describes the result of being disliked, often due to social status rather than any specific action.
And the peel stem, the intensive form, that seems to carve out a very specific identity.
It does. While the peel can intensify the action, its participle form is what we really must note. It acts as a substantive noun, meaning the enemy or the hater. This active participle, Śānēṟ, is used about 15 times and often stands parallel to the standard Hebrew words for enemy, like shibold or f.
So it's not just someone who hates occasionally.
No, it signifies someone whose very identity is defined by active, ongoing antagonism.
And we also have the noun form shinna, which allows for, what, a quantification of the emotion?
That's a good way to put it. That's the feminine qual infinitive, translated as hatred. It appears 17 times. The Hebrew idiom allows for the feeling to be intensified, underscoring its potentially destructive nature. The sources specifically cite phrases like shinda gritzla, great hatred, which we'll definitely discuss later in the violent context of 10 Samuel 13:15.
Then what's the other one?
Talichina, which is complete hatred, from Psalm 139.22. The language here just confirms that the root can articulate the most extreme form of human antipathy.
This technical survey confirms that Gina stands in definitive opposition to hub, to love. The two verbs really define the poles of relationship.
Oh, absolutely. When Scripture presents these two in contrast, it compels the listener to acknowledge a radical, intentional choice between two moral or relational alignments. Psalm 119.163 is a perfect illustration. Falsehood I hate, I abhor, but your law I love.
The text is stating that the heart cannot harbor both the love of God's truth and the love of deception. One must be deliberately rejected for the other to be truly embraced.
With that linguistic background established, let's move into how Śānēṟ functions in the messiness of human relationships. We can start with the straightforward qual usage, simple interpersonal enmity. Right, this is the most intuitive application. It's person-to-person antagonism, the general hatred of a person. You can think of Abimelech's people telling Isaac, "You are much mightier than we, and you must depart from us." That signals a hostile relationship rooted in fear and envy. Or the familial conflicts, like the hostility Jephthah faced from his brothers in Judges 11.7.
The quintessential narrative example, of course, has to be Joseph.
Joseph's story is a masterclass in how Śānēṟ can destroy a family. His brothers hated him because he was the preferred son and because of his prophetic dreams. This hatred was active, it was motivating, and it eventually led to the crime of selling him into slavery. It demonstrates that hatred, when it's allowed to fester, is inherently destructive to kinship and covenant.
But the sources also show this hatred isn't limited to individuals. It describes communal and national divisions.
Absolutely. The feeling is often rooted in larger religious or social differences. We see the righteous hating the assemblies of evildoers, or those who are inconstant and double-minded. Furthermore, it is the defining label for national antagonism. The enemies of Egypt, or those who actively hate Zion. Śānēṟ describes the chasm between two defined groups.
In the biblical text, it locates this feeling in the deepest parts of the person.
Yes, it's located in the luj, the heart, which is the center of will and motivation, and in the nopesh, the soul or life force. So when we read that David's soul hated a group, it signifies a total whole-person rejection of their presence or actions. We even see the rare reflexive use, shana no sho, to hate one's own life, suggesting self-destructive behavior driven by rejection or despair.
Now we arrive at the spectrum of aversion, and we need to contrast the two extremes here. Intense, visceral passion versus just, mere relational aversion.
The most intense, destructive passion is found in the story of Amnon and Tamar in 2 Samuel 13.1. After committing a grievous sin, Amnon's desire for Tamar instantaneously transforms into Śānēṟ, a great hatred.
This isn't just regret, it's a revulsion so powerful it equals the love he previously held.
The text states that the hatred was greater than the love with which he had loved her. This is a dramatic illustration of intense, sudden ingress of hatred, describing a postcoital sexual revulsion rooted in sin and shame. It shows Śānēqqi functioning at its most volatile, emotionally devastating, and destructive peak.
And yet the same root can be significantly diluted. It can move from that extreme malice to simply avoiding or not wanting something.
This contrast is crucial for understanding the word's scope. In Proverbs 19.7, the text describes how all the brothers of the poor man avoid him. The usage of Śānēqqi here means feel aversion for, or not want, or avoid. There's no sense of murderous malice, only social rejection and abandonment. The semantic range spans from the destructive passion of Amnon to the quiet social neglect described in Proverbs.
This brings us to the core linguistic challenge of the word. The Deuteronomic legal context and the status of the Śānēqqi, the scorned wife. This is where the English word hate fails us entirely.
This context is vital because it proves that Śānēqqi does not always denote moral evil or wickedness. Sometimes it refers to a status reduction, being unloved or critically loved less than another. The qual feminine passive participle is Śānēqqi.
And the primary, most referenced example is Jacob and his wives, right? Genesis 29.
Jacob and his wives, exactly. Jacob loved Rachel, but he's Śānēqqi Leah. Now, if we apply the Amnon definition of hatred here, we would conclude Jacob was actively trying to destroy Leah. But the text doesn't support that at all. The sources are clear. Leah was Śānēqqi because she was less beloved or unpreferred compared to Rachel. Her status was marginalized. God's response opening Leah's womb was a recognition and reversal of that social injustice, not a response to malice.
And the Deuteronomic law then formalizes this distinction when it addresses polygamy and inheritance in Deuteronomy 21. This isn't a description of emotional preference. It's a legal definition of family status.
Absolutely. The law deals with a man who has two wives. One is a huba, the preferred, the loved one, and the other is the nuno, the less beloved, neglected, or scorned one. The law doesn't forbid the preference itself, but it prevents the preference from resulting in legal injustice concerning the inheritance.
So the father cannot allow his preference for the huba wife to disinherit the son of the uni wife, even if that son is the firstborn. The law intervenes specifically because the uni status, this lack of preference, would unjustly alter the line of inheritance.
That is its function. It's a protective measure. The Śānēqqi is still legally a wife, but her inferior standing is acknowledged by the law. We also see Śānēqqi used in cases where a husband hates his wife, sometimes leading to false accusations and potential divorce. But the central point remains. In the context of the Śānēqqi, the word means a refusal of the full, affectionate relationship expected, leading to a diminished status.
It is really stunning that the same word describes both the most intense malice in the Bible with Amnon and the status of being a second-place wife, Leah. This just highlights why translation must always be anchored in context. So if the previous section dealt with aversion between people, this next section focuses on moral aversion, the righteous use of Śānēqqi. The sources show this root applied to abstract concepts, and that transforms it into an ethical posture required by the covenant.
This is a critical point for Reformed theology, the need for active moral aversion. Śānēqqi is applied to things, C-A-E-C-Re, as the lexicons say, not just people. The command is explicit, particularly through the prophets. Hate evil and love good. That's Amos 5.15, Micah 3.2.
That command sets up a dual obligation, so it's not enough to passively avoid evil. We must actively cultivate an aversion to it that parallels our love for good. What specific evils are detailed?
The wisdom literature gives us a whole catalog. We are commanded to hate violence and wickedness, evil conduct, falsehood and lying, and injustice and false witness. This aversion is essential for righteous living.
I find the application to things we might not instantly label evil very illuminating. Things like the hatred of knowledge or labor.
Those are uses where the subject of the hatred is foolish. For example, the fool who hates knowledge is not rejecting some abstract evil, but he is rejecting the mechanism of his own spiritual and intellectual growth. The hatred of instruction, musar, or discipline results in self-destruction. And Kohela's weary statement of hating his own labor reflects the futility of work done without God.
And this connects directly to the anthropomorphic depiction of wisdom itself in Proverbs. Wisdom is not passive. She has moral preferences defined by Śānēqqi.
That's right. In Proverbs 8.13, wisdom, Luma, speaks, detailing her very character. She states that she hates pride, arrogance, evil conduct, and perverse speech. This is not simply listing things one should avoid. It establishes the immutable nature of wisdom itself as having a righteous standard of aversion. If wisdom hates these things, they are absolutely antithetical to the divine order.
And those who reject wisdom are then defined by their counter-aversion, equating their disposition with death itself.
Proverbs 8.36 uses the piel participle to describe those who hate me, meaning wisdom, concluding that they love death. Hatred of the divine moral order is self-inflicted judgment. It shows that Śānēṟ of the good is a fatal disposition. To gauge the strength of this moral aversion, let's look at how Śānēṟ interacts with other verbs of rejection. Śānēṟ is frequently parallel to terms suggesting disgust or complete rejection. It's paired with tib, which is to abhor, to despise, and to disdain. This pairing confirms that when Śānēṟ is applied to concepts of moral evil, it denotes a fierce moral loathing, a total rejection, not a mere preference.
And we see a slightly softer yet still morally critical application when the word is used in relation to material gain.
Yes, in context dealing with wealth, Śānēṟ often means to actively avoid or reject dishonest profit. Jethro advises Moses to appoint judges who are men who Śānēṟ dishonest gain. This is not just a passive acceptance of honesty. It requires an active, conscious aversion to corruption. They must shun tainted money, illustrating a moral preference that governs behavior and public office.
Okay, now we move to the application of Shān to the divine person of Yahweh. The sources anthropomorphically depict God using this root, which is a powerful statement about his holiness and sovereignty. This seems crucial for a reformed understanding of God's righteous nature.
God's use of Śānēṟ is never arbitrary. It is always tied to his immutable standard of righteousness and justice. He hates actions, practices, and people who stand in direct opposition to his covenant standard. His aversion is perfect, it's consistent, and it's eternal.
What are the primary targets of divine Śānēṟ in terms of actions and practices?
Idolatry and associated practices are high on the list. Yahweh hates the practices of heathen worship, such as passing children through fire and standing cultic pillars, the mataba, because these practices defile the covenant relationship. He also hates wickedness, the pull of men, and actions that insult his holiness, like theft disguised as a religious offering.
But the prophetic indictments are perhaps the most jarring. They show God hating the very religious system he established when it's practiced hypocritically.
This is where the depth of God's moral aversion truly hits home. God states he hates Israel's feasts, solemn assemblies, and sacrifices. We see this in Isaiah 1, Amos 5. Why? Because the people are using religious ritual as a substitute for obedience and justice. The outward performance of piety, when the heart is full of injustice and covenant breaking, becomes detestable to him. Their actions sever the relationship.
Let's discuss the specific and probably the most challenging application of divine aversion. Yahweh's posture toward Esau in Malachi 1.3.
Malachi 1.3 states plainly, Esau I hated. The sources guide us here by noting that this use of Śānēṟ speaks of a sovereign choice and a defined divine standard. When you view this through the lens of Romans 9, this is often interpreted within the context of election, a rejection of Esau's line relative to the covenant purposes established with Jacob.
So this aversion is not capricious personal wrath, but the establishment of a sovereign relationship, defining who is within the covenant and who is outside the established land of promise. It defines a national and spiritual separation rooted in God's predetermined plan.
That's the proper interpretation. It is a posture of aversion that distinguishes one nation from another in the context of redemptive history, defining one as the recipient of the covenant promises and the other as outside that specific trajectory.
We must also consider the legal and covenantal application of Śānēṟ to marriage, specifically divorce in Malachi 2.16.
The Masoretic text is quite clear here. I hate divorce, Śānēṟ. This is a dramatic theological statement. God, who established marriage as a lifelong covenant, expresses active aversion to the severing of that union through dismissal. It reinforces the idea that Śānēṟ results in separation, and in this case, God opposes the breaking of a lawful, established covenant.
So it's a condemnation of covenant faithlessness that results in relational severing.
Exactly. It shows that God's Śānēṟ is always aligned with upholding his moral and relational order. He hates that which breaks apart what he has joined.
Interestingly, the sources also document the inverse, verses where the prophets accuse God of hatred, or where Israel misrepresents God's feelings.
This shows the difficulty and intensity of the covenant struggle. Prophets sometimes use this intense language. You see it in Jeremiah 12 or Hosea 9 to describe God's ingress of hatred toward his people due to their persistent sin. This describes the theological consequences of breaking the covenant. Conversely, the people of Israel sometimes falsely claim God hates them, often as a justification for their own disobedience or lack of faith, shifting the blame for their own predicament onto God's character.
On the flip side of this, we have the designation of the enemies of Yahweh, Śānēঃ Yahweh. This root defines those in active, systemic opposition to God's rule.
This term is critical. The most powerful example is its inclusion in the Ten Commandments, where Yahweh visits the iniquity of the fathers upon the children of those who hate me. Hatred of God is covenantal treason with intergenerational consequences. This is not casual unbelief, it is active antagonism.
And the active, substantive form of the word, the piel participle mensen Yahweh, that becomes a military and theological identifier.
It solidifies the opposition. When the ark moves, the declaration is that God's enemies seen Śānēঃ Yahweh should flee. This terminology defines a specific class of people, those who are actively, positionally against the divine order. They're not just people God dislikes, they're enemies defined by their chosen posture of antagonism toward God's righteous rule.
This brings us back to law, but with the highest stakes, homicide. Śānēঃ is not just an emotion in Israelite law, it is the technical element that defines the difference between a capital crime and an accident.
This is one of the most astonishing functions of the root. It's the legal definition of premeditation. The entire system of cities of refuge hinges on the presence or absence of prior hatred between the killer and the victim.
Okay, explain the no-hater concept, Luciano.
The law establishes that for a killer to be protected in a city of refuge, he must be a no-hater, meaning the death occurred without malice aforethought. Deuteronomy 4.42, 19.4, and 6 specify that the death must happen without having previously been his enemy. If the killer and victim had no prior established relationship of Śānēঃ, the law recognizes it as involuntary manslaughter, and the killer is afforded sanctuary.
Wait, so the English word hate in this context is doing the heavy lifting of determining premeditated malice, which is the legal difference between an unintentional killing and a capital crime?
Precisely. Let's imagine a hypothetical scenario from the law. Two men are felling trees. One man's axe head flies off and strikes the other, resulting in death. If the sources show they were Luciano, they had no prior antagonism, it's manslaughter. The community would not treat this as murder.
But conversely, the presence of Śānēঃ elevates the crime to capital murder.
If the same scenario occurs, but it can be proven that the killer acted in hatred Śānēঃ, or that he was motivated by an existing feud, the law strips away the right to sanctuary. The presence of Śānēঃ, the emotional state, is the deciding factor that proves premeditation, classifying the crime as capital murder. The internal condition of the heart carries direct, lethal, legal consequence.
So the legal structure confirms that Śānēঃ is the root cause of separation, whether it's the separation of the murderer from the sanctuary or the separation of life from the victim.
The law is structured to recognize that hatred is inherently destructive and requires separation from the community if it leads to bloodshed.
And finally, let's pivot from homicide law to community moral law, specifically the prohibition against internal hatred found in the Holiness Code.
Leviticus 19.17 contains a universally applicable prohibition that governs the internal life of the covenant community. You should not hate your brother in your heart.
This is a remarkable command because it focuses not on the act, but on the internal disposition, the feeling located in the lead, in the heart. It forbids secret, festering antipathy.
It demands total integrity. The standard of the covenant community requires that members not harbor hidden malice toward one another. The implication, reinforced by the positive commandment in the very next verse, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, is that concealed hatred is a transgression against the communal bond that must be confronted and resolved through reproof or reconciliation, rather than being allowed to breed secret bitterness. The moral command is to seek unity and love, and Śānēঃ in the heart is the obstacle to that unity.
We have gone from the structure of a capital crime to the internal integrity of a community member, all through one word.
Looking across this entire semantic field, the core takeaway is the functional outcome of Śānēঃ. It results in definitive distance, separation, or the severing of a relationship. Whether it is the emotional distance between Jacob and Leah, the legal severing of a marriage, the functional distance between the murderer and the city of refuge, or the absolute chasm between a righteous God and wickedness, Śānēঃ defines the boundary.
It really is stunning. This deep dive shows us that Śānēঃ is so much broader than the English hate. It ranges from the most intense, destructive passion, like Amnon's revulsion, to a formal legal distinction, like the Śānēঃ wife, and it defines the righteous posture of God-hating sin and ungodliness, and requiring covenant people to do the same.
Right. Śānēঃ compels us not just to avoid evil actions, but to actively cultivate a righteous aversion to sin itself, while maintaining a disposition of love toward our covenant brother, even if reproof is necessary.
Before we close, let's connect this linguistic finding forward. We noted that the Greek translation of shono is usually misane, and that Greek word appears famously in the New Testament, specifically in Luke 14.2 where Christ says, "If anyone comes to me and does not misane his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple."
Given the Hebrew nuance we discussed, the juna can function as a comparative, meaning to love less than or to set in a position of lesser status, just as Jacob hated Leah relative to Rachel. That is the very context required here.
So, therefore, based on the deep linguistic foundation of shono as a descriptor of comparative status and necessary separation, this New Testament command is not a call to Amnon-level malice against your family.
Not at all.
Rather, it is a required prioritization. It demands a definitive, sovereign choice to reduce the status of all earthly relationships, even the most sacred ones, relative to the supreme covenant relationship with Christ. It is a necessary reduction of earthly status to elevate the kingdom standard above all else. That's a thought for you to continue mulling over, building on the profound linguistic detail we've uncovered today.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Śānēঃ.
Until next time, keep seeking wisdom.